There are crimes driven by rage. And then there are crimes driven by waiting. Some minds don't burn hot. They cool themselves. They learn how to live inside delay, how to stretch time until it becomes weightless. What looks like restraint is not morality. It is rehearsal. Tonight's story is not about how violence explodes. It's about how it is stored, quietly, over years. If you're drawn to stories that explore the mind before the crime, subscribe to Killer Mind, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Then stay with me. Watch until the end. To understand Israel Keyes, you have to abandon the usual timelines. There was no rapid escalation, no visible spiral. What defined him was not frequency, but spacing. Long, deliberate gaps, months, years, time not as an obstacle, but as a tool. From the outside, his life appeared unremarkable. He worked construction, he paid bills, he raised a child. He could sit across from someone and hold a normal conversation without leaking urgency, anger, or fascination. This wasn't an act performed to deceive. It was the byproduct of a mind trained to feel nothing when nothing was happening. Keyes did not need to pretend to be normal. He simply learned how to turn sensation down. This is the first misunderstanding people make. They assume danger must announce itself through instability, through visible strain, through cracks. But some minds don't crack. They compartmentalize. They reduce emotional noise to a low, steady hum. Not because they are calm by nature, but because they practice calm like a discipline. Waiting became his baseline. He learned early how to endure boredom without discomfort, how to let time pass without consequence. For most people, waiting creates pressure. Thoughts accumulate, impulses demand release. For Keyes, waiting did the opposite. It smoothed the interior, it removed urgency, it allowed intention to sit untouched, like an object sealed in plastic. This is what made him appear functional, reliable, even dull. There were no dramatic swings, no visible obsessions. He didn't fixate outwardly because fixation was internalized and paused. The mind learned to place desires on a shelf and walk away, not suppressing them, just delaying them indefinitely. And delay is powerful. Psychologically, waiting can become its own reward. Each day without action reinforces control. Each year that passes proves mastery over impulse. Over time, the self-image shifts. The person no longer sees restraint as effort. It becomes identity. I am someone who can wait. That belief is dangerous, not because it is aggressive, but because it feels earned. Keyes traveled often, not chaotically, but without a visible pattern. Work trips, vacations, drives that seemed ordinary. To anyone observing, the movement had no narrative. But inside his mind, each mile fed a growing internal map. Geography wasn't scenery, it was storage. Locations became placeholders for future intent. Importantly, these thoughts were not constant. He didn't wake every day consumed by them. He didn't need to. The plans didn't decay. They waited, just like he did. This is where the illusion of normalcy becomes most convincing. When a person does not appear tense, we assume there is nothing pressing beneath the surface. We read calm as absence, but calm can also be containment. The longer nothing happened, the more stable he seemed. There is something deeply unsettling about that equation. We are taught to look for escalation, for agitation, for warning signs that grow louder. But what if the most dangerous period is the quiet one? The years where nothing goes wrong, where routines harden, where patience is rewarded. Keyes' life reinforced this pattern again and again. He could plan without consequence, think without exposure, move without being seen. Each successful year of non-action strengthened the belief that time was on his side, and time, when weaponized psychologically, changes the relationship to consequence. If nothing happens for long enough, the mind begins to feel exempt from interruption, invisible, untouchable. This is not intelligence. It is persistence paired with emotional detachment. He didn't crave chaos. He didn't seek attention. There was no need to test boundaries publicly. The internal world was sufficient, rich. quiet, controlled. Planning wasn't frantic. It was methodical, almost administrative. Lists without deadlines, ideas without urgency. This is the foundation that made everything else possible. Not the crimes themselves, but the years before them. The years where nothing happened, because in those empty stretches of time, the mind was learning something critical, that it could hold in tension indefinitely without consequence. That restraint equaled power. That silence equaled safety. And once that lesson settles in, it doesn't feel dangerous anymore. It feels normal. What sustained Israel Keyes was not action, but rehearsal. The planning did not feel like anticipation in the conventional sense. There was no countdown, no marked date on a calendar. Instead, preparation became a background process, quiet, repetitive, almost meditative. A ritual performed without witnesses and without urgency. Years before any act, he buried objects in places that meant nothing at the time. Remote areas, forests without names. Locations chosen not for symbolism, but for forgettability. The point was not secrecy alone, it was psychological distance. By separating preparation from execution by years, he stripped it of emotional heat. When something is buried long enough, it stops feeling immediate. It becomes theoretical. These caches were not trophies. They were anchors, proof that the future had already been accounted for, that somewhere out there, beneath soil and snow, the plan already existed, waiting. What mattered most was not what was buried, but when. Time transformed the act of hiding into something closer to authorship. He was writing chapters far in advance, knowing he wouldn't reread them for years. The delay itself became reassuring. If nothing had gone wrong yet, nothing would. This is how patience mutates into confidence. The travel patterns followed the same logic. There was no comfort zone, no familiar hunting ground. Randomness was intentional, but not chaotic. Different states, different regions. Distance functioned as insulation. Each location felt disconnected from the last, preventing emotional build-up or repetition. He didn't return to relive. He moved on to reset. Maps were not studied obsessively. They were consulted calmly. Routes selected not for efficiency, but for obscurity. The goal was not speed. It was forgettability. He wanted to pass through places that left no impression, because impression invites memory, and memory invites pattern. The more fragmented the geography, the safer it felt. Psychologically, this created an illusion of control without immediacy, planning without commitment, preparation without pressure. The act itself, when it eventually came, was treated almost as an administrative task, necessary but not exciting. This is the part that is often misunderstood. The satisfaction did not come from violence, it came from maintenance, from knowing that the system still worked, that years later the cache would still be there, that the route would still be drivable, that the world had not noticed. Every successful retrieval reinforced a dangerous belief that time itself was cooperating, and time, when it appears cooperative, becomes addictive. The preparation was invisible by design. There were no outward changes, no obsessive behaviors that leaked into daily life. The rituals happened in isolation, on trips that looked ordinary, in moments that blended into work schedules and vacations. To everyone else, he was simply passing through. Internally, though, something else was happening. Each completed step, each buried object, each scouted location reduced the emotional weight of the future act. It was no longer an unknown. It had been rehearsed mentally so many times that when it finally occurred, it felt oddly anticlimactic. That was the point. Anticipation creates anxiety. Anxiety creates mistakes. By stretching the process across years, he eliminated both. The crime became just another step in a long sequence, not a breaking point. This is how a mind learns to detach consequence from action. The danger here is subtle. From the outside, preparation looks like nothing. There is no visible tension, no countdown, no escalation, just time passing, years of apparent normalcy. But inside, the repetition of planning without interruption builds a false sense of invulnerability. If nothing has intervened yet, why would it? The absence of resistance is misread as permission. This is where patience becomes a blind spot. The longer the system functions, the less it is questioned. Procedures harden, assumptions solidify. The idea that something could go wrong feels abstract, almost rude. An interruption would violate the internal narrative of control. So the ritual continues, not faster, not more intense, just quietly. And because it is quiet, it is missed. There is no moment where the world could point and say, this is where it started. Because it didn't start. It accumulated, slowly, invisibly, across years that looked empty but were internally full. By the time action finally occurred, the psychological work had already been done. The violence itself would be brief. The waiting, that was the real practice. When the moment finally came for Israel Keys, it did not arrive with adrenaline. There was no surge, no emotional spike, no sense of release. That is what years of waiting do to a decision. They drain it of intensity. By the time action occurred, it had already been lived through dozens of times in his head. The mind had rehearsed every movement, every transition, every possible interruption. What remained was execution, quiet, procedural, almost disappointing in its brevity. This is important to understand. The violence was not the climax. It was a checkpoint. The act itself lasted minutes, sometimes less. No spectacle, no lingering. It was treated like a task that needed to be completed so the system could return to equilibrium. The goal was not chaos. It was closure, not emotional but logistical. After years of containment, the action did not feel explosive. It felt compressed. And compression is unsettling because it reveals the true imbalance, an enormous psychological investment spent on a fleeting outcome. The scale does not match. Years of preparation for seconds of action. This mismatch is not accidental. It is the point. For Keys, the reward was not the moment itself, but the confirmation that the waiting had worked, that nothing had interrupted him, that the world had remained indifferent long enough for the plan to reach its conclusion. The violence, stripped of narrative, was almost an inconvenience. This challenges how we normally frame danger. We expect intensity at the moment of harm. We look for emotion, for loss of control. But here, control was absolute. The act was cold, not because he lacked feeling, but because feeling had already been processed and neutralized over years. Emotion was spent in advance. Once the action ended, there was no lingering presence, no fixation, no return to the scene. He moved away quickly, not out of panic, but out of habit. The plan had always included the exit. The aftermath was as rehearsed as the beginning. This rapid return to normalcy is what makes this type of violence difficult to detect. There is no visible come-down, no behavioral residue. He did not unravel because there was nothing to unravel. The internal tension had already been released gradually over time, not all at once. Afterward, he blended back into routines effortlessly. Work, family, conversations. The same emotional flatness that enabled waiting now enabled forgetting. This is where the illusion becomes complete. To outsiders, nothing had changed. No agitation, no relief, no visible shift. The person they saw before was the person they saw after. The mind had been trained not to register the act as disruptive. And that is deeply unsettling, because it suggests that violence does not always fracture identity. Sometimes it is absorbed. The crime did not define him in his own mind. It was simply a completed step in a long process, something checked off and placed behind him. The real identity, the patient planner, the observer, the one who could wait, remained intact. This is why the act itself feels almost irrelevant in retrospect. It did not transform him. It did not escalate him. It did not satisfy anything permanently. If anything, it reinforced the belief that patience worked. That belief is the danger. When the mind concludes that time plus planning equals immunity, the future feels safe. Not morally safe, but procedurally safe. As long as the rules are followed, as long as the waiting is respected, nothing will interfere. This is how repetition becomes possible without escalation, not through compulsion, but through confirmation. Each successful cycle strengthens the system, but systems, no matter how controlled, contain assumptions, and assumptions over time become blind spots. The very patience that allowed such meticulous containment also delayed feedback. There were no small mistakes to correct early, no near misses to introduce doubt. The long gaps between actions meant fewer data points, fewer opportunities for reality to intrude. Confidence grew not from brilliance, but from lack of interruption. And lack of interruption is not the same as invincibility. The minute of violence passed quickly. What lingered was not emotion, but belief. Belief that the waiting had been justified. Belief that the system was sound. Belief that time itself was an ally. That belief would eventually fail him, but not yet. At this stage, the silence returned. The routines resumed. The waiting began again. And from the outside, it still looked like nothing was happening. The system that Israel Keyes built was designed for distance. Distance in geography. Distance in time, distance between preparation and consequence. As long as those distances held, the illusion of control remained intact. But systems built on patience have a weakness. They assume the future will behave like the past. They trust consistency, and eventually that trust hardens into complacency. The break did not come from emotion. There was no sudden rage, no panic, no loss of restraint. It came from confidence. Years of waiting without interruption taught him a quiet lesson, that the method was flawless, that randomness protected him, that long gaps erased patterns. Each successful cycle reinforced the belief that he understood the limits better than anyone else. This is how patience becomes arrogance. The final failure was not a dramatic shift in behavior. It was subtle, almost boring. A decision made without the usual distance, a shortcut in time, not in effort. The system was still there, but it was compressed. For the first time, preparation and action moved closer together. That compression mattered. What had once been spread across years now unfolded within weeks. The mental buffer that had protected him, time, was reduced. And without that buffer, the mind had less room to correct mistakes. He still believed he was detached, still believed he was invisible, but the conditions had changed, and he didn't notice. This is the danger of extreme discipline. It blinds the person to variance. When a method has worked repeatedly, it stops being evaluated. It becomes doctrine. Deviations feel unnecessary, even inefficient. So when small irregularities appeared, they were dismissed. A camera here, a transaction there. A trace that would normally have been absorbed by time now lingered. The world had not suddenly become more vigilant. The system had simply shortened its own margins. What followed was not immediate collapse, but tension. Something he had spent years training himself not to feel. For the first time, there was overlap between action and awareness. The mind that had relied on distance was forced to stay present, and presence was unfamiliar. This is where the psychology begins to fracture, not because he felt guilt or fear in a conventional sense, but because the rhythm was broken. Waiting had always restored balance. Now there was nothing to wait through. The usual strategy, distance, no longer applied. As scrutiny increased, the discipline that once created calm now created rigidity. He stuck to assumptions that no longer fit. He trusted routines that were no longer sufficient. The same patience that had protected him now slowed adaptation. This is the paradox. A mind trained to endure delay can struggle when speed is required. When the arrest finally came, it did not arrive as a shock of realization. It was closer to interruption. An external force stepping into a narrative that had gone unchallenged for too long. In custody, the mask did not fall away dramatically. There was no emotional collapse. What appeared instead was something quieter, the absence of the future. For a person who had always lived in preparation, confinement removed the ability to plan meaningfully. No maps, no travel, no distant horizons. Time, which had once been a resource, became static. And in that stillness, something unexpected happened. He began to talk, not in bursts of confession, but in controlled fragments, measured disclosures, as if even now he was rationing information the way he had rationed action. The same discipline remained, but it was no longer useful. The system had failed, but the mindset persisted. This is an important distinction. Capture did not dismantle the identity, it simply removed its tools. The patience was still there, but with nowhere to go, it turned inward. The interviews revealed no triumph, no relief, just a continued effort to manage time, to delay, to control the pace, to dictate terms. Even in collapse, the need for containment remained. But the blind spot had already done its damage. The belief that patience guaranteed safety had been proven false. Not because patience is ineffective, but because it is not adaptive. And systems that cannot adapt eventually expose themselves. The waiting was over, not with chaos, but with limits. After his arrest, Israel Keyes was no longer moving through space. He was confined to time. This distinction matters. His entire psychological structure had depended on motion, on the ability to place distance between thought and consequence. Travel created insulation. Waiting created safety. Now both were gone. What remained was stillness. In a controlled environment, the discipline that once served him became inert. There were no future routes to plan, no distant locations to imagine, no caches waiting beneath the ground. The architecture of his identity, built on deferred action, had nowhere to extend. This is when patience reveals its final cost. A mind trained to live in preparation struggles when preparation becomes meaningless. Without the promise of future action, waiting loses its purpose. Time no longer stretches forward, it pools. During interviews, he attempted to reassert control the only way he knew how, by managing pace. Information was given slowly, selectively. Details were withheld, not necessarily to deceive, but to maintain the familiar structure of delay. Even in confinement, he tried to live in intervals, but delay without outcome is different. The conversations lacked drama. There was no catharsis. What emerged instead was a flattened emotional landscape, not emptiness, maintenance. He spoke as someone still organizing an internal system, even though the system no longer connected to reality. This is unsettling because it shows how deeply the waiting had shaped him. It was not a phase. It was not situational. It was the core mechanism through which he understood himself. The crimes did not define that mechanism. They were byproducts. When people search for meaning here, they often look for revelation, a final explanation, a hidden truth unlocked by confession. But there is no deeper layer. The structure is the explanation. Years of restraint did not produce insight. They produced habit, and habits persist even when their original purpose disappears. In confinement, the absence of stimulation did not provoke chaos. It provoked continuation. The same emotional containment, the same lack of urgency, the same attempt to live as if time could still be managed. But time in custody does not cooperate. There is no future event that validates the waiting. No release of tension, no return to equilibrium. The system collapses not through explosion, but through irrelevance. This is where the story becomes quietly tragic, not in a sympathetic sense, but in a human one. A mind engineered for patience encounters a reality where patience no longer yields power, and there is no alternative strategy. What follows is not transformation, but stagnation. The years of preparation, the careful spacing, the emotional discipline, all of it leads here. To a place where time passes but nothing accumulates, where waiting no longer reinforces identity but erodes it. This is the end state of a psychology built entirely on delay, not exposure, not remorse, not understanding, just stillness. And in that stillness, the illusion finally dissolves, not because the person recognizes it, but because the world no longer responds to it. The patience that once felt like control becomes indistinguishable from emptiness. There is no final act, no concluding gesture, just time continuing without permission. There is a common mistake we make when we think about violence. We look for noise, we look for escalation, instability, emotional overflow. We expect danger to arrive loudly, through rage, through desperation, through loss of control. But this story suggests something far more unsettling. Sometimes the danger is silence. Israel Keyes was not defined by chaos. He was defined by absence, by years where nothing appeared wrong, by long stretches where life continued normally, routines held, and no urgency leaked through. The threat was not an outburst. It was patience. A mind trained to wait does not trigger alarms. It blends, it adapts, it learns how to exist without demanding anything from the world. And because it demands nothing, it draws no attention. This is why the warning signs were not actions, but time. The years of normalcy, the lack of escalation, the calm that never broke. What makes this disturbing is not the violence itself, but how little space it occupied in the story. Minutes compared to decades of psychological construction. The act was brief. The preparation was endless. And when that preparation finally failed, it did not fail loudly. It failed because the world imposed limits that patience alone could not overcome. This is the final illusion to confront. Discipline is not insight. Control is not awareness. And persistence is not intelligence. Sometimes the most dangerous trait is the ability to wait without feeling pressure. Because when nothing happens for long enough, we stop looking. And by the time something finally does, the mind behind it has already been living with the idea for years. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's intentional. Killer Mind isn't about fear. It's about perception. Subscribe for more psychological crime stories that explore the mind before the crime. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And in the next episode, we'll examine another case where the absence of warning signs was the warning itself. Because the most unsettling question is not why it happened. It's how long nothing happened before it did.